No, we'll have to... Hot weather. Yesterday I was working down the brook. Seen a bobcat.
Is it?
Yeah.
How big?
Oh, quite big. He was chasing a rabbit. That damn hot that both of them were walking. Pretty hot weather. Pretty hot weather.
Sandy, you've been working in these woods for what, 8 years now?
Yeah, that's right.
Suppose there's any truth to those rumors about Fraser's putting a pulp mill here in the river?
I believe none of it.
No rumors.
That's right.
Not one.
No truth to that at all.
Sort of been the way of life for people around here for years, though.
Correct, yeah. Every year they come up with the same story. I don't believe none of it.
Let's call her a day.
Yeah, well, I think that should be all right. Yes, sir. Well, here we are again. We got another day in.
Back home again.
Yeah, that's right. Now we'll try to get some rest now for tomorrow. Okay, there now.
Dougie,
What?
we get her pretty rough, you know.
That's right.
Back around the turn of the century, 3 pulp mills here in the river. One up in Millerton, one down in Millbank, one over in Chatham.
That's right.
Now we don't have a damn thing.
Yeah.
It's depressing, isn't it?
Well, kind of, yes.
Want to play some cards? Maybe that'll clear my mind.
No, not really. I'm going to have a good smoke. I'm kind of tired there, and that'll be it for today, I think.
You're getting too old anyway.
What?
Let's call her a night. I wonder if things will ever change around here.
Well, things did change for Joe and Jean-Guy and for the people of the Miramichi. The change did bring back a way of life that had for years eluded them. The forest lands and subsequent resulting industry, which had once flourished on the river, would regain its composure and retrace the road back to a way of life all Miramichiers had at one time known. From the day William Davison arrived on the Miramichi in 1765, industry benefiting from our forest lands began charting its course. Mr. Davison was one half of a team who led English-speaking settlers to lay their foundations on the banks of the great Miramichi River. The other was John Court. Together, the duo received a township grant of 100,000 acres to commence a shipbuilding business. In a separate engagement, he supplied the Royal Navy with masts for their schooners. The timber trade began inconspicuously in 1775, when Mr. Davison decided that he had to keep his fishermen employed in the winter. He sent them into the woods to cut timber, and the resulting outcome was the establishment of 2 water-powered sawmills on the northwest Miramichi. From then on, William Davison was considered the lumber king of the river. In years which followed, many pioneering spirits inhabited the area, including the likes of Joseph Cunard, Gilmore, Rankin and Company, and the Abrams. Many were a greedy, feuding spirit, though, as the upper class dominated the region and were not afraid to bring this to their laborers' attention. To them, people were expendable. This type of existence prevailed well into the 19th century before an inexplicable event took place. October of 1825 marked one of the worst ill-fated catastrophes ever entered into the annals of documented history. The Miramichi fire burned 6,000 to 7,000 square miles of forest and community. Nearly 1,300 people from both Newcastle and Douglastown were left homeless, and an incredible 200 human beings perished in the flames. The masting industry was curtailed as a result of the inferno, paving the way for the more modern sawmilling age. Sawmills were created to produce a specific type of lumber known as deal, which is a board of fir or pine 9 inches or wider and 3, 4, or 5 inches thick. Names such as the Richies, Birchills, Hicksons, Robinsons came to dominate the Miramichi economy. They were a powerful breed and controlled the area both economically and socially. They were kings in their own backyards, but their presence spelled good employment figures and reassured families of food on the table. Lumbering in early times was practically a year-round task. Cruising, estimating, laying out of campsites, logging roads, and landings were activities conducted usually in the summer months. Lumbering operations would, for the most part, have their beginnings in the latter part of September or early October. Living conditions of early lumbermen were very primitive, to say the least. The camp would consist of 3 sections: the cook room, men's room, and a dingle in between for storing the wanigan and supplies. Nearby, the hovel would accommodate teams of horses for use in the woods. The camps were low log cabins with 1 bunk lining the 4 walls. A fireplace in the center provided heat with a means for cooking. At the end of each working day, and after supper had been depleted, the men would amuse themselves with song, verse, and story for a few short hours before bedtime. As soon as the camp was completed, cutting and skidding would begin. A crew consisted of 6 men, 2 sawyers, a teamster, swamper, knotter, and yard piler. Anything over 125 logs would be considered a fair day's work. As a rule, the logs were quite large, with none being smaller than 12 inches on the stump. Depending on weather conditions and the completion of contract, cutting and skidding would continue until New Year's or later. As soon as this was executed, hauling off operations would begin. This would require 6 well-equipped teams making 4 or 5 long treks daily, subject to the distance between log yards and streams. After all the hauling had been completed, the men would wait for the first sign of warm weather to again return to the woods and bring the timber down the streams and rivers. Cracks in the ice appeared almost consistently around the middle of April. Crews would have already been hired, many of whom participated in the wood harvest activities thus far. Their driving boots would be corked, awaiting the signals that for years have alerted them of their employ. These men were experienced, and crew bosses wanted only those with such know-how to work their drives, as fatalities often occurred among the novice. When the streams were sufficiently clear of ice, work would begin putting the landings in. This would usually be an 8 to 10 day operation, depending occasionally on the capacity of the stream. With a large crew working on the landings, the stream would be heavily loaded. In order to keep the logs floating freely, men would be stationed within calling distance of each other all the way downstream. They patrolled their sections constantly and could usually break a jam at the start. As can be imagined, logging was very labor-intensive, with men working 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week for 5 to 6 months straight, without ever slowing down. With a heavy run of logs on a fast-flowing stream, a jam was a major possibility. Thousands of logs would back up for quite some distance, halting all work on the landings. The boss would then summon only his most experienced men to break the jam, for it was a dangerous assignment. When the jam let go, logs would break like matchsticks due to the tremendous pressure of wood backing up. Before the Great Depression hit the Miramichi, one could stand on the Morse Bridge in Newcastle and count 10 sawmills on the river. Also visible from this standpoint in the spring of the year were the boat-driven log booms slowly making their way to the respective mills. This was a very dangerous undertaking, requiring men who were experienced in running boats through high and swift waters, managing log jams, and rescuing men from the river. The logs being driven down by a number of different companies arrived in the booms all mixed together. Each log would have to be hand-sorted and run into special pockets according to their mark. Every mill owner used a different colored paint, as well as a different mark, a stroke, or spot. The 20th century marked the beginning of a new era in terms of industrial modification. Sawmilling was no more the dominant force it once was. Pulp mills were gaining popularity as far as economic trendsetters were concerned. Pulp sold for more per volume. In addition, the sawmills could not use the more abundant smaller trees, as they created problems in the manufacturing process. This left the door wide open for the pulp producers, as small trees were a readily accepted raw material in their field. The region around Newcastle was the location of a number of Canada's earliest chemical pulp mills. The first mill to have its foundation laid was the Maritime Chemical Pulp Company. Located in Chatham, construction began in 1886, with tragedy striking the following year in the form of a fire. No production had been achieved. Strong-willed Miramichiers rebuilt the plant immediately and operated it profitably for years thereafter. The second early pulp mill to commence operations was the Dominion Pulp Company, located across the river from the Maritime Chemical Pulp Company, in what is now known as Millbank. This mill became Fraser Company owned at a later date, but ceased operation in 1932 as a direct result of the overbearing Depression years. Another mill, known as the New Brunswick Sulphate and Fiber Company, began turning out a meager 15 tons a day of kraft papers in 1901. Located in the township of Millerton, the mill was hit by fire and destroyed in 1914. All hope for prosperity in this area was marred, and helplessness engulfed the community until 1916, when the mill was rebuilt. Unfortunately, the mill did not operate to its potential and was abandoned in the early 1920s forever as a pulp-producing entity. For the next quarter century, pulping operations on the Miramichi ceased to exist. Early history of sawmills in South Nelson seemed to indicate that Thomas W. Flett was the first owner-operator around the turn of the century. A shrewd proprietor, Mr. Flett conducted business with the aid of what was then known as a Swedish gang saw. He manufactured box hooks for packing fish and canned goods, and also barrel staves for making wooden barrels. This, of course, was in addition to the conventional lumber requirements. All operations on this property were ceased, and the property was sold on March 28, 1910. In 1914, William M. Sullivan bought the business and began a large-scale sawmilling operation, which employed close to 125 people. He tried several ventures in addition to this sawmilling enterprise, including cedar shingles and a pulp debarking unit. His aggressiveness within the lumber industry made him well known throughout the province. South Nelson Lumber Company Limited bought the mill from W.M. Sullivan in 1937. It was strictly a lumber operation, with the debarker being discarded and replaced with a second gang saw to achieve this means. J. Leonard O'Brien purchased the land and its proprietary rights in 1943. Mr. O'Brien was already an established sawmill operator, having worked on his father's mill in Nelson for years. He established two different types of mills and incorporated them separately. The first was a plaswood mill located in the village of South Nelson. It was the inaugural mill of its type in North America. Here, Mr. O'Brien manufactured 4 by 8 foot panels out of a mixture of dust, shavings, and chips, all held together by resins. Trafalgar Industries was the name under which the company operated. The second operation was the traditional sawmill, which produced lumber and box shooks. Known as Chatham Industries, Britmare Division, short for British Miramichi, this mill was adjacent to the plaswood mill. In 1957, the plaswood mill burned in a terrible fire, reducing it to nothing but charred ruins. It was the end of a legacy of lumbering operations which had inhabited the site for many, many years. In 1961, J. Leonard O'Brien sold the property to a group of Italian investors who built a groundwood pulp mill and, in addition, rebuilt the sawmill on its present site in 1964. The plan to build a mechanical groundwood pulp mill in New Brunswick was first conceived by Cartier da Timavavo of Trieste, Italy, to supply the pulpwood and mechanical groundwood pulp to paper mills owned by them in Italy. Surveys and investigations indicated that it was feasible to construct the plant at the village of South Nelson, now known as Nelson Miramichi, located on the shores of the Miramichi River, approximately 25 miles upstream from the Atlantic Ocean. Construction of the plant began in 1963, and in October of the following year, commercial groundwood pulp was being produced under the name of South Nelson Forest Products Corporation. In 1966, Atlantic Sugar Refineries Company Limited had embarked upon a diversified industrial expansion program, and in September of the following year obtained full ownership of the mill, which then became known as Acadia Pulp and Paper Limited. The aggressiveness and pride of the keen workforce at Acadia proved fruitful as they began turning out 400 short air dry tons per day of flash-dried mechanical groundwood pulp, which all sold on the open market. The mill had now received worldwide acclamation as being one of the world's largest groundwood pulp producers, and at the same time bringing much needed employment to the Miramichi region. In 1973, Atlantic Sugar joined Glen-Gehr Corporation to form Janik Corporation, and the mill was put up for sale. One possibility considered by potential buyers at that time was a newsprint operation at Acadia to utilize its groundwood pulp to capitalize on nearby Miramichi Timber Resources Limited. The latter company produces bleached kraft pulp, which could be piped under the Miramichi River to the Acadia mill to provide the chemical pulp for newsprint furnish. An offer was made to Janik with this idea in mind, but was rejected by the Canadian Foreign Investment Review Agency. In that same year, a fire gutted the hydraulic system and shut the mill down for approximately 3 months. 1974 marked the beginning of stable ownership, much needed by the Groundwood site. Mr. George Petty visited Acadia Forest Products and realized that it had potential far beyond what other people envisioned. In September of that year, he secured the financial backing of some banking interests and formed a group of Canadian investors who acquired Acadia in December of that year. In order to keep the facility competitive, Mr. Petty realized that there would have to be successive capital undertakings, all of which would contribute to a more productive pulping process. By 1980, all projects were completed, and Acadia Pulp and Paper was again a prime producer of mechanical groundwood pulp, with output totaling approximately 400 tons per day. As early as the 1860s, one could find a sawmill on the present Craft Division site. Edward Sinclair owned the mill for most of its early years and brought the mill through some very tough, trying times. Fire destroyed the plant in 1883, but Sinclair, with his rambunctious type personality, rebuilt the mill immediately. It continued to function profitably for Sinclair well into the 20th century. Fraser Companies Limited bought the mill and its land in 1925 and continued to operate it on an on-off basis well into the 1940s. Donald Fraser Sr. was the man behind the already very powerful lumber operation. After the passing of Mr. Fraser, his 2 sons guided the company into a relatively new field, the pulp and paper industry. With 2 mills already in operation in New Brunswick, they turned to the Miramichi for a possible 3rd location. Much speculation blanketed the Miramichi region with respect to Fraser's erecting a pulp mill in the area. The North Shore Leader printed articles pertaining to this notion and created a frenzy of excitement amongst lumbermen and pulp makers who had for the last quarter century been denied. The idea hung over the heads of an enthusiastic community for perhaps 2 full years before any material hints could be distinguished. Then, in 1946, it happened. The announcement by Fraser's to construct and operate a new sulfate pulp mill on the bank of the northwest branch of the Miramichi River, formerly the Sinclair property, more than overwhelmed the Miramichier. It relieved a tension that had clutched the emotions of many involved in making a living off the forest lands. No one could describe the feeling, the excitement, and the pride felt on that day by everyone on that river. The new mill, when operating at full capacity, could produce 150 tons a day of premium unbleached craft pulp. Outfitted with the most modern machinery in the world, the mill took approximately 3 years to fully complete. Over the years, several modernization projects were undertaken to upgrade the facility, enabling Fraser's to compete worldwide in the pulp market. A Kmart digester, a 6-stage bleaching plant, and a second pulp machine and dryer were added, along with other minor revisions over the years. And these additions contributed to the increase in tonnage output to approximately 500 tons per day. On January 22nd, 1970, Fraser Companies Limited sold the Newcastle mill to Boise Cascade Canada Limited in partnership with several European owners. The mill operated under the name Miramichi Timber Resources Limited for 8 years, until 1978, when Boise Cascade Canada Limited became sole owners. The name was changed to Ontario, Minnesota Pulp and Paper Company to reflect their ownership in other ventures on the Ontario-Minnesota border. Figuring, though, that the name was not appropriate for the area, it was changed again in 1979 to Boise Cascade Canada Limited, Newcastle Division. During the period 1977 to 79, more modernization took place, approximately $50 million, involving the restructuring of the bleach plant, installation of number 4 power boiler, a series of modifications to the Barker area, and restructuring of the washing and cleaning system. As a result of these changes, output was increased to 550 tons per day. In May of 1985, something special happened on the Miramichi. Repap Enterprises, the present owners of Acadia Forest Products Mill in Nelson, Miramichi, acquired the 188,000 tons a year Bleachcraft pulp mill on the Newcastle side of the river. This is the former Boise Cascade Canada Limited mill. Coupled with this great achievement is an even more remarkable event. The sod was turned for the proud new flagship of Repap's fleet of mills, the state-of-the-art lightweight coated paper facility. This mill produces paper using some of the kraft pulp and groundwood pulp manufactured at the same location. It is one of the most technically advanced and cost-efficient coated paper plants in the world. Although Repap's origins go back to 1974, major events in the past 2 years have transformed it into the world-scale, fully integrated forest products enterprise. Spearheaded by Repap's crack construction team, the ultra-modern mill sped from groundbreaking to paper making in only 14 months. It took a dedicated team to accomplish such a feat, and nowhere else would you find a more receptive spirit in doing so than that on the Miramichi. In simple terms, we built the biggest, fastest coated paper mill in the world. Startup of the paper mill occurred in July of 1986. It was vital that all training activities be conducted in a quick yet thorough manner in order to keep startup time on schedule. In all, at Miramichi Pulp and Paper, over 500 people have been trained in various jobs. A considerable task has been accomplished with the cooperation of supervisors, trainers, and trainees. The strength in our people, the human resource aspect of our organization, has once again surfaced. Although for the moment the paper mill has taken the spotlight, one must not forget the significance of the sawmill and the large-scale woodlands operation Repap also heads up. Built in 1964 on its immediate site, the sawmill has always stood hand in hand with its sister, the groundwood division. So when Mr. Petty acquired the groundwood mill, he also secured the rights to the Miramichi stud, a familiar and somewhat durable symbol amongst lumber users around the world. It employs a crew of 28 men with average output equaling 45 to 50,000 board feet a day. Destinations include Eastern Canada, the United States, and Europe. With the acquisition of Boise Cascade Limited by Repap in 1985, both Woodlands offices were combined to produce a more centralized and cost-efficient center. The needs of the two pulp mills are ensured by 1.8 million acres of timberland under license to Repap through the year 2007, and with renewal provisions built in. This provides a long-term guarantee for our timber resources well into the future and sets a precedent amongst current forest consumers. The expansion in both the sawmill and pulp and paper industries by Repap has now reached the point where the full potential harvest from New Brunswick forests will be required to keep the present mills operating. However, there is reason to believe that careful and prudent management, coupled with the introduction of intensive silviculture measures, will permit expansion of the industry in the future. Gone forever are the great days when the logging industry dominated the economic development of the province. The passing of time has removed practically all evidence of this once flourishing marketplace. But Miramichiers have adapted and accepted new roles as woodsmen in the field that their fathers once labored. It is this adaptability which has come to define our breed as survivors. As much of it is a mighty and magnificent geographical presence, the Miramichi is also a state of mind, and the key to that state is a powerful pioneer spirit. The late Dr. Louise Manny, an eminent historian who for half a century studied and recorded the annals of the land she loved, once wrote, "In its 300 years of recorded history, the Miramichi has been a land for pioneers." There was a hopeful spirit in the people who long ago spat upon their hands and pushed the forest back. And there are many signs that this pioneer spirit prevails today. So finally, we have come of age as a manufacturing area. We are now masters in our own house. Our paper machine is fed and operated by us, and we reap the benefits of her produce. She is ours, and we shall supply the markets of the world, for we are ideally situated adjacent to a deep-water port with modern facilities and in the midst of a large, well-managed forest.
Time to get up.
Oh, boy. Time to get up already.
It's daybreak.
Is it? Oh. Oh, boy. Long days and short nights. Oh.
You wouldn't believe the silly dream I had.
What's that now?
It was about, never mind. You wouldn't believe me anyway.
Oh, you're an awful boy. Start a story and then you don't finish it.
Well, it was about... Never mind. Let's get some breakfast. I'm starved.
Yeah, well, it sounds good. Never beautiful.
It wasn't a dream after all.
Place of happy retreat. I just simply say it's my mystical, magical river of mine. Oh, the mystical, magical Miramichi flowing through my mind takes me back in time when life was so fine on the mystical, magical river of mine. Takes me back in time when life was so fine on the mystical, magical